53 years ago, 12 humans walked on the moon. Nobody has gone back. Every program designed to send people back has collapsed. Constellation cancelled. The 2024 deadline missed. $93 billion spent, and NASA still cannot say what the final cost will be. The species that reached the moon in 8 years now cannot return in 50, and the reasons have nothing to do with rockets. The official explanation is comfortable: budget overruns and bureaucratic slowdowns, a bloated agency that forgot how to move fast. Washington tells that story every time a deadline slips, and the story is tidy enough that most people stop asking questions. But the evidence tells a different story. The workforce building these rockets launches once every 3 years, and the engineers who knew how to fly Apollo hardware are retired or dead. Export control laws treat allied astronauts, before and after the missions they share, as security threats. And an inspector general found billions spent, with no estimate for what the final number will be. Those numbers look damning. Every previous attempt to go back collapsed under the same weight. Constellation died. The 2024 deadline died. The pattern is so consistent, the obvious conclusion is the program is broken beyond repair. Except the obvious conclusion might be wrong, because buried inside the delays, inside the cost, overruns, and every missed deadline, the evidence points somewhere nobody expected. The moon might not be the destination at all. And if the moon is the rehearsal, every delay changes meaning. This video is one entry in a much larger series. If you want to see where the rest goes, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next in this story. The contradiction is simple. 12 humans walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. The achievement was so staggering, so complete, that the entire world assumed the footprints were the beginning of something permanent. And then nobody went back. A decade passed without a return mission. Then a full generation. More than 50 years, and counting. The longest gap in the history of human exploration, and the destination is still visible from every backyard on Earth. Something about that gap does not add up. The species that figured out how to cross 240,000 miles of vacuum in just 8 years? That same species has spent the last half-century unable to repeat the trip. I want to understand why, and the first step is looking at what Apollo actually was, because the popular memory of the moon landings has become a kind of myth, and myths tend to hide the parts that make people uncomfortable. Apollo was not a sustainable space exploration initiative. At heart, the program was a political weapon. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and made a declaration: the United States would land a man on the moon before the decade ended. That declaration had nothing to do with a plan. Moscow had just put a man in orbit, and the Cold War demanded a response loud enough to be heard from space. So every piece of Apollo, from the Saturn V rocket to the lunar module to the command capsule, was designed for one single job: get Americans to the surface of the moon and bring them home alive. No base, no supply chain, nothing left behind for the next crew to use. Each landing was a standalone expedition, each piece of hardware single use, and each footprint an endpoint. And that design philosophy came with a cost, one the history books tend to skip past: risk. Apollo accepted levels of risk that would shut down a modern space agency overnight. The onboard computers had less processing power than a pocket calculator. Heat shields were tested on exactly one uncrewed flight, and then engineers trusted the shields with a human crew. The astronauts on Apollo 8, the first humans to leave low Earth orbit, rode a rocket that had failed catastrophically on an earlier test launch. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders climbed into that capsule anyway, knowing the margin for error was razor thin. 3 astronauts, 384,000 kilometers from home, with no rescue option if anything went wrong. And then Apollo 13 proved exactly how close the margins were. An oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon. The crew spent 4 days in a freezing lunar module, using procedures that engineers improvised in real time on the ground. Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes rationed water to the point of dehydration. Jim Lovell watched the moon drift past the window, close enough to see individual craters, knowing the crew would never touch the surface. The crew survived. But the survival was not a triumph of robust engineering. What saved the crew was improvisation, raw human creativity against a machine that had almost killed 3 people. Public watched all of this on television, and the public drew a conclusion that felt obvious at the time. If America can do this job, America will keep doing this job. The moon was open. The door would stay open. And for a brief electric moment in the early 1970s, the next steps seemed inevitable. NASA had plans. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were on the schedule. A space station in lunar orbit was under discussion. Permanent habitats on the surface were being sketched on engineering paper. None of those missions flew. Apollo 17 launched in December of 1972, and when Gene Cernan climbed back into the lunar module for the last time, Cernan became the last human being to stand on the moon. Cernan reportedly dragged a boot across the regolith to trace the initials of his daughter, Tracy, into the dust. Those initials are still there. Nobody has been close enough to see them since. The remaining missions were cancelled. The budget was cut. Congress redirected the money toward the Space Shuttle program, which could only reach low Earth orbit a few hundred miles up. The Saturn V production line was shut down, and the tooling was destroyed. Not mothballed, not stored for some future program. The tooling was destroyed. Deliberately. The jigs, the molds, the custom fixtures that shaped the fuel tanks and engine housings were scrapped. And that single decision made the 50-year gap permanent, because once those molds were gone, no amount of money could bring the knowledge back. Engineers who had spent a decade perfecting the most powerful rocket ever built. Those engineers watched the production capability disappear piece by piece. Within a few years, NASA could not have rebuilt the Saturn V, even if the funding had returned overnight. The workforce had dispersed. Specialized knowledge lived in the hands and habits of technicians, many of whom had moved on to other industries or retired entirely. Rebuilding would have meant starting from scratch, relearning lessons that had cost billions of dollars and more than a decade to master the first time. And here is where the evidence takes a turn. Because what happened after Apollo was not a single failure. What happened after Apollo was a repeating cycle of ambition, announcement, and quiet retreat. In 2004, President George W. Bush stood in NASA headquarters and announced the vision for space exploration. Every word of the speech was deliberate. Language echoed Kennedy. 2 years later, in 2006, the vision became a program called Constellation, designed to return astronauts to the moon, using a new capsule called Orion and a new heavy-lift launch vehicle called Ares. And the program was real. Contracts were signed across multiple NASA centers. At the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, engineers began designing the Ares rocket. Over at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, separate teams built and tested Orion prototypes. Metal was cut, hardware was assembled. By 2009, the Ares 1X rocket had completed a successful 2-minute test flight, reaching an altitude of 46 kilometers. Billions of dollars had moved through the system. The momentum felt genuine. And then a new president took office. In 2010, Barack Obama canceled Constellation. Not because the engineering had failed. The engineering was on track. The program died because priorities shifted. An independent review panel concluded the budget projections were unsustainable, with costs climbing faster than Congress was willing to pay. 6 years of design work gone. The engineers who built the next moonship watched the projects get shelved. Tools were boxed. Prototypes sat abandoned in hangars. Ares 1, a launch vehicle that had already completed a successful test flight, was scrapped. The message could not have been clearer. A democracy had built a moon program, spent billions of dollars, and then killed the program before the first crew ever left the ground. The pattern was identical to what happened after Apollo. Grand promises followed by quiet retreats. Then, in 2017, the cycle started again. The Trump administration signed Space Policy Directive 1, directing NASA to return humans to the moon. By 2019, The effort had a name: Artemis. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine championed the program publicly, writing in the foreword of the official NASA Artemis plan, quote, "We are going, and we go together," end quote. Bridenstine pushed for international partnerships, commercial contracts, and an aggressive schedule. In 2019, Vice President Mike Pence stood at the National Space Council and announced the deadline: boots on the moon by 2024. The urgency was real. China had just landed a rover on the far side of the moon, the first nation ever to reach that hidden terrain. The geopolitical pressure was building. India was planning lunar missions. The European Space Agency was negotiating partnerships. A new space race was forming, quieter than the Cold War version, but driven by the same fundamental question: who gets to claim the next chapter of human presence beyond Earth? The energy in the space community was electric. This time felt different. But Bridenstine left office months later when the administration changed. The person who named and defined Artemis did not stay to see the first launch, and the deadline started slipping almost immediately. The original 2024 target slid to 2025, then 2026, then 2028. Each delay came with a different justification. The human landing system was behind schedule, the spacesuits needed a complete redesign, the budget request from Congress did not match the ambition the White House had declared. The Artemis 1 mission, an uncrewed test flight, did successfully orbit the moon in November of 2022. Re-entry went according to plan. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific, but when engineers examined the heat shield afterward, the surface had eroded in unexpected patterns, charring unevenly in ways the computer models had not predicted. A heat shield problem that Apollo engineers solved in the 1960s had resurfaced 50 years later on hardware that was supposed to be an improvement. Then, on April 1st, 2026, Artemis 2 finally launched, carrying the first human crew toward the moon since 1972. But the launch came after years of delays that had already reshaped the program beyond recognition. And the first landing? Artemis 3, originally marketed as the grand return of boots to the lunar surface, was redefined in February of 2026. The mission will no longer land on the moon. Instead, NASA restructured Artemis 3 as a 30-day systems test in low Earth orbit, a dress rehearsal for docking and life support performed safely in the backyard of the planet rather than 250,000 miles away. An independent safety panel had warned that attempting a first crew docking, a first cryogenic fuel transfer, and first use of new spacesuits, all in one mission at the moon, carried a compounded level of technical risk that the agency could not justify. The actual lunar landing has been pushed to Artemis 4, targeted for early 2028. Nobody has walked on the moon since Gene Cernan left in 1972, and the timeline for changing that fact keeps stretching further into the future. So, here is the case file, as the case file stands. 12 humans walked on another world more than 50 years ago. Every program designed to send more humans back has either been cancelled or delayed past the point of recognition. Tens of billions spent with no final cost estimate in sight. And the gap between what humanity achieved in the 1960s and what humanity has managed since looks less like a pause and more like a permanent condition. But I have been looking into this long enough to know something. The obvious conclusion is not always the right one, because the failures are not random. Every cancellation, every delay, every budget overrun follows the same structural pattern, and that pattern has nothing to do with whether engineers could build a rocket. The pattern has everything to do with one question: what happens when a democracy tries to fund a project that outlasts a single president? And the evidence for that structural diagnosis is about to get much more specific. The pattern should have broken by now. Artemis had every advantage the previous programs lacked: bipartisan support, commercial partners, international agreements, and a rocket that was already built. The Space Launch System was the most powerful rocket ever designed to carry humans, derived from shuttle-era technology that engineers had been refining for decades. Orion, the crew capsule, had already flown an uncrewed test in 2014. The foundation was supposed to be solid. But the moment engineers tried to assemble that foundation into a functioning launch system, the cracks started appearing. And the cracks did not stop. The first warning came during wet dress rehearsals at Kennedy Space Center in the spring of 2022. A wet dress rehearsal is exactly what the name suggests. Load the rocket with propellant, run the countdown to the final seconds, and verify that every system behaves under real conditions. The Space Launch System holds, in total, over 700,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, chilled to temperatures cold enough to turn steel brittle. On the first attempt in April, liquid hydrogen began leaking from a connection on the mobile launcher. The launch director scrubbed the test. Engineers tightened seals, replaced gaskets, and rolled the entire rocket back to the vehicle assembly building for repairs. That rollback alone took 40 hours. The crawler transporter moves at 1 mile per hour, carrying a stack that weighs 8.8 million pounds, inching across the 4-mile path between the assembly building and Pad 39B, while technicians walked alongside, monitoring every vibration. Weeks passed. The rocket rolled back to the pad. The second attempt produced a different leak at a different location. Hydrogen is the smallest molecule in existence. The gas finds gaps that no other propellant would notice. A valve that holds oxygen perfectly will weep hydrogen slowly through microscopic imperfections in the metal surface. The engineers at Kennedy Space Center were not dealing with a single broken component. The engineers were chasing a property of physics that punished every joint, every seal, every connection point on a vehicle with hundreds of thousands of individual fittings. One technician described the problem to a reporter simply as trying to hold water in a screen door. No matter how many holes you patch, the molecule always finds another way through. 3 more attempts followed across the spring and summer. Each scrub revealed a new problem hiding behind the last repair. A stuck valve on the upper stage, pressure sensors reading outside acceptable range, a mobile launcher umbilical that refused to retract cleanly during the terminal countdown sequence. Kennedy Space Center technicians worked 12-hour shifts cycling the rocket between the launch pad and the assembly building, burning weeks of calendar time on trips the crawler made at walking speed. By the time engineers declared the wet dress rehearsal complete in June, the timeline had slipped months beyond the original projection. And the rehearsal was only supposed to be a routine checkpoint. Nobody had planned for a multi-month engineering crisis before the rocket even left the ground. The Space Launch System finally launched on November 16, 2022, after 2 additional scrub days in late August and September, caused by yet another hydrogen leak and a tropical storm. 4 months of repairs just to complete a rehearsal, and 2 more launch attempts were scrubbed before the vehicle finally cleared the tower. I kept looking at those numbers, trying to find a comparable delay in any previous human spaceflight program, and nothing came close. Not Gemini, not the shuttle. The only precedent I could find was Apollo itself, and even Apollo, for all the chaos of that program, never spent 4 months fighting a single category of plumbing failure before a test flight. But the hydrogen leaks were just the surface layer. A deeper failure was hiding, and the evidence would not appear until Orion came home. The launch was flawless. Orion separated cleanly, fired toward the moon, and entered a distant retrograde orbit, carrying the capsule farther from Earth than any spacecraft designed for human passengers had ever traveled, more than 270,000 miles from the planet. For 25 days, the capsule circled the moon, tested communications, thermal control, radiation sensors, and navigation systems. Every milestone was hit. Mission controllers at the Johnson Space Center in Houston monitored telemetry around the clock. The space community exhaled. After all the delays and all the doubt, Artemis was finally flying. Then Orion came home. On December 11th, the capsule slammed into the upper atmosphere at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, faster than any human-rated spacecraft had ever traveled during re-entry. The heat shield absorbed temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Plasma wrapped the capsule in a sheath of ionized gas, so dense that radio contact with mission control went dark for several minutes. Orion splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Baja California. The parachutes deployed. Recovery teams aboard the USS Portland pulled the capsule from the water. From the outside, the mission looked perfect. Then engineers at Kennedy Space Center began disassembling the heat shield for post-flight inspection, and what the inspection revealed sent a shudder through the entire Artemis program that has not stopped reverberating. The protective surface layer had behaved nothing like the simulations promised. Ablation is the process by which the shield material deliberately burns away, carrying heat with the material as the material vaporizes. The process is supposed to be controlled, predictable even. The models predicted a smooth, uniform burn across the shield surface. What engineers found instead was uneven charring, patches where the material had eroded far deeper than expected, gouged in ways that left the underlying structure more exposed than any simulation anticipated. Other patches were barely touched, as if the heat had skipped entire sections. Chunks of ablative material had separated from the shield and broken away during descent. Nobody had predicted that kind of separation. Nobody had modeled that behavior in any simulation. The material that was supposed to burn away in a controlled fashion had instead fractured and peeled off in fragments during the most violent phase of re-entry. If those fragments had broken away differently, if the exposed sections had faced the hottest plasma flow instead of a cooler region, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The heat shield had survived, but the heat shield had survived by luck as much as by design. Post-flight inspections documented charring and erosion in more than 100 places across the shield surface. NASA's investigation traced the root cause. Gases generated during re-entry were getting trapped inside the ablative material. Normally, those gases vent outward through the charred layer, but because the specific material lacked sufficient permeability, internal pressure built up until the shield cracked from the inside, and the agency's response introduced yet another complication. Rather than redesigning the shield entirely, NASA changed the way astronauts would return to Earth. Artemis 1 had used a skip entry maneuver, where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, skips back out like a stone skimmed across a lake, and then re-enters. The skip reduced speed and lowered the gravitational forces on the crew, but the maneuver also made the heat shield problem worse by allowing trapped gases to build up during the skip phase. For Artemis 2, NASA chose to skip the skip, performing a steeper, more direct re-entry that is harder on the crew's body, but safer for the shield. A harder ride for the astronauts, in exchange for a shield that does not crack. That decision captures the engineering reality of the entire program. Every solution carries a cost, and every cost reshapes the mission in ways nobody originally planned. What does that mean for a crewed flight? The problem was not that the heat shield failed. The problem was that the heat shield worked for reasons the engineers did not fully understand. And in human spaceflight, a heat shield that works for unknown reasons is a heat shield that cannot be trusted with human crew. Apollo engineers faced a similar challenge in the 1960s, but those engineers solved the problem with a single-piece heat shield design and a methodical series of high-velocity arc jet tests at the Ames Research Center in California. The Artemis heat shield used a completely different architecture, individual blocks of ablative material bonded to a titanium skeleton, redesigned after the 2014 exploration flight test. That redesign had been necessary because the single-piece approach proved too difficult to manufacture at the scale Orion required, but the block design introduced variables, and more than 30 ground tests across multiple NASA facilities could not fully characterize those variables. The interaction between the block gaps, the airflow disruption caused by those gaps, and the ablation patterns during actual re-entry at orbital velocity produced behavior that existed outside the boundaries of every simulation the agency had run. An entire generation of thermal modeling tools had failed to predict what a real atmosphere would do to a real heat shield at real speed. The engineers who built the shield had done every procedure right by the standards of every test the engineers could run on the ground. The atmosphere simply did not care about the ground tests. NASA pulled Artemis 2, the first crewed flight, from the schedule while engineers investigated. The mission finally launched on April 1st, 2026, after years of delays. The original plan had called for astronauts Weed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen to orbit the moon by late 2024. Reed Wiseman had spent years preparing for the mission, leading the crew through hundreds of hours of simulation training at the Johnson Space Center. Victor Glover had already flown to the International Space Station on a SpaceX Crew Dragon. Christina Koch held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 days aboard the station. Jeremy Hansen had trained for over a decade as part of the Canadian Space Agency Astronaut Corps. The Artemis II seat was the result of a deal where Canada built the robotic arm for the Gateway station in exchange for one astronaut slot. One country traded a robot for a ticket to the moon. That ticket sat on hold for years. The Artemis II date slid to 2025, then 2026. The launch window slipped from early February to March to April, as wet dress rehearsal failures and a helium leak in the upper stage forced yet another rollback to the vehicle assembly building. NASA acknowledged that understanding the heat shield charring behavior was a prerequisite for putting crew on board. The direct descent re-entry profile was the agency's answer, but the engineering problems were not confined to the launch pad or the heat shield. On the ground, a crisis was brewing that had nothing to do with rockets or re-entry. The spacesuits. NASA had been developing a new spacesuit called the Exploration Extravehicular Mobility Unit for over a decade, and a 2021 Inspector General report delivered a verdict that stunned the agency. After spending more than $1 billion on spacesuit development across 16 years, NASA did not have a single flight-ready suit for lunar surface operations. 16 years of development, $1 billion spent, and not a single flight-ready suit to show for any of the effort. The report traced a pattern of schedule delays, technical redesigns, funding shortfalls, and shifting requirements that had turned a critical piece of hardware into a case study in procurement dysfunction. Suits needed for lunar walks had to handle temperature swings from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to negative 280 degrees in shadow. And the thermal challenge was only the beginning. Each suit also had to protect against abrasive lunar dust that shreds conventional fabrics and provide full mobility for astronauts carrying tools and collecting samples in 1/6 gravity. Every previous spacesuit NASA had built was designed for microgravity work in low Earth orbit. Walking on the moon demanded fundamentally different engineering. The old Apollo suits worked, barely, but those suits weighed over 180 pounds on Earth and left astronauts exhausted after just a few hours on the surface. Gene Cernan came back from the Apollo 17 moonwalk with suit joints so stiff from lunar dust infiltration that mission planners worried whether the suit would allow Cernan to re-enter the lunar module. A permanent presence on the moon required suits that could handle dozens of surface excursions without degrading. Nothing in the existing inventory came close. NASA eventually pivoted, awarding a contract to Axiom Space to develop commercial spacesuits for Artemis III. But the pivot added years to the timeline and introduced a new dependency on a company that had never built a spacesuit for operations beyond low Earth orbit. And the cascading changes did not stop at the capsule or the suits. The rocket itself was redesigned. For years, the plan called for upgrading the Space Launch System to a more powerful version called Block 1B, featuring a massive new upper stage called the Exploration Upper Stage. That upper stage had been criticized for years of delays and climbing cost overruns. Under NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman, the agency canceled the Exploration Upper Stage entirely, along with the Block 1B and Block 2 upgrades. To standardize the fleet and escape the cycle of multi-year gaps between launches, NASA selected United Launch Alliance's Centaur 5 as the new upper stage for the Space Launch System, starting with Artemis 4. The Centaur 5 is a dual-engine stage already flying on ULA's Vulcan rocket, a near drop-in replacement compatible with the existing mobile launcher. The decision traded development ambition for operational pragmatism, a pattern that had become the defining characteristic of every Artemis redesign. The spacesuit crisis and the rocket redesign that followed exposed the truth that the hydrogen leaks and the heat shield charring had already hinted at. The individual components of the Artemis program were not failing in isolation. The components were failing in sequence, and each failure cascaded directly into the next one on the list. Fix the hydrogen leaks and the heat shield fails in unpredictable ways. Fix the heat shield and the spacesuits are not ready. Outsource the spacesuits to a commercial provider and the landing system timeline slips because SpaceX Starship, selected as the human landing system for Artemis 3, had never completed an orbital refueling test or a crewed lunar descent. Does that sound like a collection of isolated problems? Artemis was not confronting isolated technical failures. A systemic failure was at work, a cascading architecture where every subsystem depended on every other subsystem, and a delay in any single component propagated through the entire schedule like a shockwave through a building with no internal walls. That pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time engineers solved one problem, the solution exposed or created another problem downstream. The program was not failing in a straight line. The program was failing in a web where every strand connected to every other strand. And the numbers confirmed the diagnosis. A Government Accountability Office analysis found $6.8 billion in cost overruns across 3 major Artemis development contracts. The Inspector General projected that total Artemis spending between fiscal year 2012 and 2025 would reach $93 billion. Costs could potentially climb to hundreds of billions over the next 2 decades. That number alone is staggering. But here's the detail that should disturb anyone tracking the program closely when the Inspector General recommended specifically that NASA provide a total cost estimate for the Artemis campaign. The agency refused. Not could not estimate, not lacked the data to calculate, refused to estimate. The recommendation was filed as non-concurred. The agency building the most expensive human spaceflight program in history could not or would not tell Congress what the final price would be. Consider what that refusal means. Apollo had a number. The number was staggering, roughly $200 billion in current dollars, but the number existed. Congress could weigh the cost against the benefit and make a decision with open eyes. Artemis has no number. The budget grows mission by mission, contract by contract, with no ceiling and no projected endpoint. Every delay adds cost. Every cost increase adds political vulnerability. And every cycle of political vulnerability brings the program one step closer to the same fate that killed Constellation. The frustration is not that the problems exist. Complex engineering programs always have problems. Apollo had catastrophic problems. The frustration is that the problems follow a pattern, and the pattern is accelerating. Heat shield failures compound the schedule. Schedule slippage compounds the budget, and budget overruns, in turn, compound the political vulnerability that haunts every long-duration program. And political vulnerability, that is the one force that has killed, without exception, every single previous attempt to return to the moon. So here is where the investigation stands. I have spent 22 minutes walking through hydrogen leaks, heat shield anomalies, billion-dollar spacesuit fiascos, and a cascading dependency chain that turns every fix into a new crisis. The easy conclusion is that the program is broken. And honestly, part of me wanted to stop the investigation right there because the evidence is damning. But I have been digging through the structural data underneath these engineering headlines, and the evidence points somewhere unexpected. The cascading failures are not random. Every breakdown shares a common root, and that root has nothing to do with whether engineers can build a rocket, a heat shield, or a spacesuit. A deeper force is driving the pattern, and the diagnosis is about to get much more uncomfortable. Forget the rockets. For the past 20 minutes, every failure in this investigation has looked like an engineering challenge: leaking hydrogen, a heat shield that charred in patterns no model anticipated, a spacesuit program that consumed more than $1 billion without delivering a single piece of flight-ready hardware. Every one of those failures has a technical explanation, and every technical explanation has a technical path forward. Engineers fix technical problems. That is the entire profession. But I get pulling on the thread underneath the headlines. And the thread leads somewhere the engineering coverage never goes. A structural force is driving the failures, a force that no engineer can repair regardless of talent or budget. The force is not mechanical. The force is institutional, buried so deep inside the system that no repair manual can reach the problem. And the evidence starts with the workforce. Here is a number that rarely makes the news. The Space Launch System, is the most complex human-rated rocket ever assembled. Standing taller than the Statue of Liberty, the vehicle dwarfs every rocket in the current American fleet. The core stage alone holds more than 500,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. That is an enormous amount of volatile propellant. Building, testing, and launching a machine of that scale demands a workforce with deep operational mastery, not textbook knowledge. Hands-on mastery, the kind that only accumulates through repetition. The complexity runs deeper than size. Congress mandated that the Space Launch System incorporate Space Shuttle heritage components, a decision that reduced development risk on paper by reusing proven technology and protecting existing supply chains. In practice, the mandate produced a hybrid vehicle straddling two eras. The core stage uses 4 RS-25 engines, the same power plants that propelled the space shuttle for 3 decades, but refurbished and recertified for an expendable mission profile the engines were never designed for. Solid rocket boosters derived from shuttle-era designs, with an additional segment for increased thrust. Meanwhile, the upper stage, the crew capsule, and the launch abort system are entirely new. Every technician on the program must simultaneously maintain expertise in 40-year-old engine hardware and master systems that had never flown before Artemis. Knowledge from the shuttle era does not transfer cleanly. Old procedures apply partially, modern protocols fill the gaps. And the integrated vehicle behaves differently from either ancestor. Engineers at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, where the SLS core stages are manufactured, have described the challenge of maintaining quality standards across hardware spanning 4 decades of aerospace evolution, with some components meeting 1970s era specifications and others meeting 2020 era requirements. At peak operations, NASA launched a Saturn V every 8 to 10 weeks. Technicians at the Kennedy Space Center cycle through every major system on a rhythm fast enough to keep institutional memory alive. An error caught during Apollo 11 preparations could be corrected and verified on the Apollo 12 vehicle within months. The procedures were not merely documented. The procedures were rehearsed, refined, and embedded in the muscle memory of a workforce that handled the hardware constantly. A team operating at that tempo understood the rocket the way a concert pianist understands a keyboard, not because the sheet music is memorized, but because the fingers have repeated the movements so many times that the body responds before the conscious mind finishes processing. The Artemis workforce operates on a fundamentally different timeline. Between the first Space Launch System flight in November of 2022 and the planned second launch, more than 3 years have elapsed. 3 years between operational launches. During that gap, experienced technicians cycled through unrelated assignments, retired or accepted positions at SpaceX, Blue Origin, or defense contractors offering higher salaries and faster project cycles. And across every one of those months, the embedded knowledge that resides in the hands and habits of experienced workers, knowledge that procedure manuals cannot capture, dispersed across the aerospace industry like heat radiating from cooling metal. The consequences appeared on the launch pad. During the Artemis I campaign, Kennedy Space Center managers formally documented workforce knowledge retention as an operational risk. The multi-month wet dress rehearsal delays were not caused by flawed engineering designs. The designs had cleared review. Those breakdowns emerged from a gap between what the procedures assumed and what the team had actually practiced. Procedures written during the Space Shuttle era assumed a ground crew that had rehearsed a full integrated countdown sequence multiple times, but the Artemis ground crew had not. Program managers noted that technicians carrying shuttle-era experience brought assumptions about system behavior that no longer applied to the reconfigured hardware. Knowledge from an earlier era served as a starting point, but the Space Launch System is a different machine with different failure modes. The distance between inherited assumptions and actual behavior cost months of schedule. For a workforce launching once every 3 years, every launch is functionally a first launch, with the learning curve resetting to a level close to 0 each time. I want to be clear about what the evidence does and does not show. The men and women staffing the Artemis program, at the Kennedy Space Center, at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, and at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, rank among the most capable aerospace professionals on the planet. Talent is not the issue. Tempo is the issue. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman has said the problem plainly. Launching a rocket as complex as the Space Launch System only once every 3 years leads to skill atrophy among the workforce. People are not getting enough practice, and the lack of practice is leading to mistakes. A workforce that flies once every 3 years cannot accumulate the embedded fluency that a team flying every 10 weeks develops organically. NASA has proposed a solution. Increase the launch frequency to once every 10 months, fast enough to keep the hardware and the teams sharp. The standardization of the Space Launch System around the Centaur 5 upper stage, replacing the cancelled Exploration upper stage, was designed in part to support that faster tempo. But a cadence of once every 10 months requires a budget Congress has not yet committed to and a pipeline of missions that does not yet exist. The proposed fix identifies the right problem. Whether the political system will fund the fix is a separate question entirely. And tempo is not a variable the engineers control. The budget determines the tempo, Congress determines the budget. Congress operates on a rhythm dictated by appropriation cycles, election timelines, and competing national priorities that have nothing to do with when a rocket needs to fly. The moment the investigation crosses from engineering into politics, every delay takes on a different character entirely. The next structural failure involves a challenge money cannot fix: cooperating with allies. 23 countries have signed the Artemis Accords, a set of principles for peaceful cooperation in space. The signing ceremonies generated favorable press and warm diplomatic language, but the Inspector General investigated the substance behind the symbolism, and the findings describe a coordination structure held together by optimism rather than institutions. Signing the accords does not commit a nation to building anything, funding anything, or contributing hardware to the Artemis campaign. The accords are a declaration of principles, not a participation agreement. To join the program, each country must negotiate a separate bilateral agreement with NASA. Those agreements are governed by export control frameworks, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and the Export Administration Regulations designed to prevent sensitive military technology from reaching adversaries. The purpose is legitimate, but when applied to allied space agencies working on civilian lunar missions, the results verge on the absurd. One case captures the dysfunction. A Canadian astronaut has been assigned to the first crewed Artemis flight, a seat earned through a deal in which Canada agreed to build the robotic arm for the Gateway Lunar Station. That astronaut trained alongside 3 American crew members at the Johnson Space Center for years, logging hundreds of hours in simulators, rehearsing emergency procedures for every conceivable failure mode, and preparing to ride inside the Orion capsule at re-entry velocities exceeding 25,000 miles per hour. The trust required to share a spacecraft during the most dangerous phase of any mission is total. The crew functions as a single unit, or the crew does not survive. Under current export control rules, that same astronaut is legally restricted from accessing certain categories of technical information about the vehicle during periods before and after the flight. NASA personnel must escort international crew members through restricted areas. Technical documents must be individually screened and cleared before an allied astronaut can examine them, even during routine training activities. The Inspector General specifically flagged these restrictions as a hindrance to effective crew operations. I have examined contradictions throughout this investigation. This one might be the most baffling. Trusted in orbit, restricted on the ground, partners in name, strangers in practice. The dysfunction extends beyond individual restrictions. Every Orion capsule that flies to the moon carries a European service module, manufactured by Airbus Defence and Space under contract to the European Space Agency. The service module provides the power, propulsion, and life support that keep the crew alive during transit. Without the European-built hardware, the American spacecraft cannot complete a lunar mission. ESA currently holds contracts for 6 service modules. America cannot reach the moon without Europe. Europe has no ride to the moon without America. The interdependence is total, and yet the institutional framework governing that critical partnership lacks the coordination mechanisms, the joint planning boards, and the long-term commitment structure that the International Space Station partnership established through decades of operational experience. The Inspector General found that the Artemis campaign has no comprehensive forums for international partners to participate in flight planning, safety reviews, or research integration. No standing working groups. No overarching intergovernmental agreement defining partner roles, responsibilities, or cost obligations. The 54 Artemis-related international instruments NASA has negotiated cover a range of contributions from communications equipment to habitat modules to scientific payloads. But without a central coordination body, the integration of those contributions depends on bilateral relationships that NASA manages one at a time. The structure grows exponentially more complex with each new partner. For missions beyond the fourth flight, NASA has issued no architecture that incorporates international contributions at all. 23 nations expressed formal interest in exploring the moon together, and the institutional machinery to coordinate the effort does not exist. The workforce is thinning between launches. The international partnerships are operating without binding agreements or institutional coordination. And beneath both of those structural fractures sits the deepest one, the budget, and the political system that governs the budget. The total Artemis spending figure is public, documented by the Inspector General, and climbing with every fiscal year. Projections reach into the hundreds of billions over coming decades. But the number that should alarm anyone tracking this program is the one that does not exist. No official cost estimate covers any mission beyond the fourth Artemis flight. The Government Accountability Office has flagged growing complexity and interdependency across Artemis projects, calling the combined effort more complex than any previous human spaceflight program. And when the Inspector General formally recommended that NASA produce a total campaign estimate, the agency declined to comply. A program without a declared price has no political ceiling, but a program without a declared price also has no political floor. Every appropriation cycle becomes a moment of vulnerability because Congress cannot defend what Congress cannot quantify. For fiscal year 2026, Congress provided $7.8 billion for Artemis systems through regular appropriations, with an additional $6.7 billion directed through a separate legislative vehicle. Significant investment, but investment that arrives year by year, subject to annual debate and exposed to the same shifting priorities that ended every predecessor program. Compare that fragility to the one program that actually reached the finish line. In 1961, John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade ended. That promise was not vague. A hard deadline focused the effort, and the political context made the spending virtually unchallengeable. Cold War urgency drove every appropriation. Moscow had already placed a man in orbit. The assassination of Kennedy in 1963 transformed the lunar commitment from a political gamble into the final charge of a martyred president. For one brief, unrepeatable window, the political establishment unified behind sustained space spending because the cost of failure, measured in geopolitical humiliation, exceeded any conceivable budget objection. Artemis has no equivalent anchor. The program has survived 3 presidential transitions since 2017. Each new administration inherited the effort midstream, reviewed the costs, debated the direction, and made a judgment call about whether to continue. Jim Bridenstine, the administrator who named the program and wrote in the official foreword, quote, "We are going and we go together," end quote, departed when the administration changed months before the first launch. The program survived. The champion did not. In 2019, Vice President Pence stood at the National Space Council and declared that American astronauts would land on the moon by 2024. The timeline was aggressive by any standard. China had just placed a rover on the lunar far side, the first nation to reach that hidden terrain. India was accelerating lunar ambitions. The geopolitical clock was ticking. But a deadline set by a political calendar carries a structural defect. The hardware does not care who wins the next election. The hydrogen still leaks at the Kennedy Space Center, regardless of which party controls Congress. and the development timeline answers to physics, not to a 4-year term. When the deadline slipped past the end of the administration that declared the deadline, the failure surprised nobody who had been watching the pattern. The constellation precedent confirms the vulnerability is not theoretical. In 2004, a new return to the moon program was announced with specific hardware, contracts, and milestones. Over 6 years, billions of dollars flowed into the effort. At the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, engineers designed the Ares rocket. At Johnson in Houston, teams built and tested Orion prototypes. Metal was cut. Contracts were distributed across NASA centers in multiple states. The Ares 1X rocket completed a successful test flight in 2009, reaching an altitude of 46 kilometers. The engineering was proceeding on schedule. Then a new president took office, commissioned an independent review, and canceled the entire program. Not because the hardware had failed. The review panel concluded the budget projections were unsustainable. 6 years of design work, billions of dollars committed, and a successful test flight behind them, all erased because the political consensus rotated with the election cycle. The question rising from the structural evidence is not whether Artemis has engineering problems. Every complex program has engineering problems. The question is whether any political system that resets every 4 years can sustain a project demanding decades of consistent funding, consistent international coordination, and consistent institutional commitment. Apollo answered that question once, under conditions that no longer exist. Every program since Apollo has answered the question in the opposite direction. A bill climbing past every original projection, no declared endpoint. International partners waiting for a framework that does not exist. A workforce rebuilding operational memory from scratch between every launch. An entire architecture resting on a political consensus that must hold across election after election after election in a system that has never, outside a single Cold War exception, demonstrated the capacity for that kind of patience. The pattern from the previous half-century is pressing against Artemis with the same weight that crushed Constellation, that buried the Post. Apollo plans that ended every ambitious commitment the moment the political direction shifted. And yet, one detail in the design decisions does not fit the pattern. Because buried inside the architecture, inside the choices that appear to be inflating cost and timeline, beyond what a simple return to the moon would demand, the data points toward a possibility that changes the meaning of every delay, every overrun, and every missed deadline. The destination might not be what anyone assumed. Not the moon. Follow the evidence one more step, and the entire case changes direction. Because buried inside the architecture of Artemis, inside the design choices that have been inflating the cost and stretching the timeline past every original projection, the data does not point toward a simple return to the lunar surface. The data points toward Mars. I did not expect to find that connection. Every thread in the investigation pointed toward a program buckling under the weight of workforce decay, political fragility, and cascading engineering failures. The obvious conclusion was that Artemis was dying the same slow death as every predecessor. But when I started pulling apart the specific design decisions, the ones that seemed to be making the program more expensive and more complicated than a straightforward lunar return would demand, the architecture told a different story. Every design choice that looks like over-engineering for the moon makes perfect sense if the moon is not the final destination. Start with the orbit. The Gateway station will not circle the moon the way Apollo did. Apollo orbited low, roughly 60 miles above the surface, close enough for the lunar module to descend and return with minimal fuel. Simple and efficient, optimized entirely for a brief visit. The Gateway will fly a completely different path. The station will travel a near rectilinear halo orbit, a stretched, egg-shaped loop that takes 6.5 days to complete. At the closest approach, the Gateway passes within roughly 1,000 kilometers of the lunar surface. At the farthest point, the station swings out to 43,500 miles. From a purely lunar perspective, that orbit makes the job harder. Astronauts in the lander must burn more fuel to reach the surface from a staging point that sits farther away. The travel time between orbit and surface increases. The abort options narrow. Every lunar operations engineer would prefer a lower orbit for a moon-only program. So why did NASA choose the harder path? Because the same orbital mechanics work at Mars. Jude Moranci, the Chief of Strategy and Architectures of the Johnson Space Center, presented the rationale at a NASA architecture workshop in 2023. Selection criteria for the Gateway orbit explicitly included what the agency calls Mars forward capability. The halo orbit sits at a gravitational balance point between Earth and Moon. At that location, long-duration station-keeping costs drop to roughly 10 meters per second of propellant per year, a fraction of the fuel required to maintain a low lunar orbit over the same period. And that fuel efficiency is not just a convenience for lunar operations. Maintaining a station at a gravitational balance point is exactly the operational profile a future crew would need at Mars. A station orbiting Mars in an analogous halo orbit would conserve propellant in the same way. The gravitational interaction between Mars and the Sun would hold the station in position with minimal correction burns. The Gateway orbit is a rehearsal orbit. NASA selected the path that teaches crews how to exist and operate at the gravitational margins of a planetary body. Because the next planetary body on the list is 140 million miles away. But the orbit was not the only Mars forward decision. Consider the engine, the power and propulsion element. The module that will push the Gateway through the halo orbit uses solar electric propulsion. Sunlight converts to electricity, which then accelerates ionized xenon gas to produce thrust. Exhaust velocity is extraordinarily high, orders of magnitude more efficient than chemical rockets for sustained low-thrust maneuvers over months and years. Solar electric propulsion cannot produce the raw force needed for a crewed launch from Earth, but for long-duration station keeping, for slow-burn trajectory adjustments, for pushing a crewed platform from one orbit to another over weeks of continuous firing, solar electric propulsion is the leading candidate for a Mars transit vehicle. The NASA NRHO orbit document states the point plainly. Placement at a higher gravity well staging point supports the demonstration of large-scale solar electric propulsion capabilities, which the agency identifies as a key objective for Mars-forward technology development. In other words, the Gateway is not merely a moon station that happens to use advanced propulsion. Every firing of those ion engines is a rehearsal for the journey to Mars. Now bring the investigation down to the surface. At the lunar South Pole, NASA plans to build Artemis Base Camp, and the blueprint for that base reveals the same dual destination logic that shaped the orbit. The first element is a lunar terrain vehicle, an unpressurized rover that can carry crew around the landing site, standard equipment for any surface mission. Apollo had a rover, and Artemis will have a rover. Nothing surprising there. But the second element is a capability Apollo never imagined. A habitable mobility platform, a pressurized rover large enough for 2 astronauts to reside inside for 30 to 45 days. Not a car, a mobile apartment. The crew would drive the pressurized rover away from base camp across kilometers of terrain, sleeping and working inside the vehicle for weeks at a time before returning. Think about those numbers: 30 to 45 days, sealed inside a pressurized cabin, driving across terrain with no atmosphere and no rescue infrastructure closer than 250,000 miles away. That capability is wildly excessive for a program designed only to visit the moon. Apollo crews spent a maximum of 3 days on the surface. Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt drove the Apollo 17 rover for a total of about 36 kilometers across 3 excursions, each lasting a few hours. Even the most ambitious lunar science mission would not require a pressurized rover capable of month-long expeditions. So who is the rover built for? NASA planning documents answer the question directly. A sustained lunar presence report, published in 2020, states the connection without ambiguity. The habitable mobility platform is described as a particularly important element because a similar type of vehicle will be needed to explore Mars. Not a luxury, a dress rehearsal. Engineers will test mobility systems, life support, radiation shielding, dust mitigation, thermal control, and crew autonomy on the lunar surface, where a rescue mission from Earth takes 3 days, before committing the same design to a planet where rescue is physically impossible. Every kilometer driven in the pressurized rover is a kilometer driven toward Mars. Every system failure caught on the Moon is a failure that will not kill a crew on a world where the nearest help is 7 months away. Consider the geography of the test site. The lunar South Pole is not a random selection. Permanently shadowed craters near the pole have not seen sunlight in billions of years. Temperatures inside those craters plunge below -200 degrees. Water ice hides in that darkness, trapped for eons. Shackleton Crater alone is 12.5 miles across, a depression so vast that the entire capital beltway around Washington, D.C. would fit inside the rim. Driving a pressurized rover into and around terrain of that scale, in conditions that hostile, with crews operating autonomously for weeks, is the closest analog available anywhere in the solar system to the conditions a future Mars crew would face on the red surface. The base camp infrastructure continues the pattern. In situ resource utilization systems, the technology for extracting water and oxygen directly from lunar soil and ice will be tested at the South Pole. ISRU is useful on the Moon. On Mars, ISRU is not a convenience but a requirement for survival, and that claim is not an exaggeration. A crew traveling 140 million miles from Earth cannot carry enough water, oxygen, and fuel for the entire mission. The mass budget simply does not close. Every kilogram of consumable launched from Earth costs thousands of dollars in fuel just to escape planetary gravity. A 2-year round trip to Mars with a crew of 4 requires water for drinking, hygiene, and cooling systems, oxygen for breathing and for producing rocket propellant, fuel for the return trip. The numbers are staggering. If every gram of every consumable must travel from Earth to Mars, the launch mass requirement exceeds what any rocket currently under development can deliver in a reasonable number of flights. The math breaks the mission before the mission begins. The only way to close the gap is to manufacture consumables at the destination. If crews cannot learn to harvest resources from the ground beneath the landing site, a sustained Mars presence is not a question of ambition. A sustained Mars presence is a question of physics that cannot be solved by building a bigger rocket. Testing ISRU at the lunar South Pole, where permanently shadowed craters harbor water ice that has not seen sunlight in billions of years, provides the closest operational rehearsal available anywhere in the inner solar system. The Moon is the laboratory. Mars is the exam. And then comes the evidence that made the entire investigation pivot. The split crew operations. The NASA Sustained Presence Plan describes a specific mission profile for later Artemis campaigns, and the profile does not resemble any lunar mission ever flown or proposed. 4 astronauts travel to the Gateway. The crew resides aboard the station for a multi-month stay, not because the Moon demands months of orbital preparation, but because the stay simulates the outbound transit to Mars. During those months, the crew tests long-duration life support, radiation exposure management, exercise protocols against bone density loss, and the psychological dynamics of 4 human beings confined to a volume smaller than a studio apartment, surrounded by vacuum, with Earth shrinking to a blue dot behind the viewports. Then 2 crew members descend to the lunar surface with the habitable mobility platform, while the other 2 remain aboard the Gateway in orbit. The surface crew explores for weeks. The orbital crew conducts research and maintains the station. Eventually, all 4 crew members reunite at the Gateway for another multi-month stay, this time simulating the return trip to Earth before finally descending to a splashdown on the home planet. The Sustained Presence document calls these missions the first operational tests of the readiness of long-duration deep space systems and of the split crew operations that are vital to the approach for the first human Mars mission. Study that profile one more time. 4 astronauts confined to a small station for months during simulated transit, 2 descending to a surface while 2 remain in orbit. Weeks of surface operations with autonomous decision-making, because the communication delay to Mars can stretch past 20 minutes each way, making real-time mission control impossible. Reunion. Months of simulated return transit. That is not a Moon mission. That is a Mars mission performed at lunar distance, where the safety margin allows for mistakes that Mars would punish with death. Every element of that multi-month mission architecture, the expanded gateway habitation, the longer surface stays, the autonomous crew operations far beyond anything Apollo attempted, exists because the same profile will be used the first time humans travel to Mars. The moon is the stage, and the rehearsal is the performance. I want to be precise about what the evidence does and does not show. The Mars forward design philosophy is not a conspiracy theory unearthed from classified documents. The connection is printed in plain language across multiple NASA planning documents, strategy presentations, and policy directives. Space Policy Directive 1, signed in December of 2017, states the objective explicitly: the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, followed by human missions to Mars. The NASA Sustained Presence Report describes the gateway as a critical analog for human missions to the surface of Mars. The NRHO orbit selection documents cite Mars forward capability as a primary architectural driver. Every major hardware element, the station, the orbit, the pressurized rover, the ISRU systems, the split crew mission profiles, was designed to serve two destinations, not one. And that revelation transforms the meaning of every delay, every overrun, and every missed deadline. Remember the workforce that launches once every 3 years? Low tempo is a problem for any program, but the institutional knowledge being built is not just lunar operations knowledge. Those engineers and technicians are learning to operate a deep space station, manage solar electric propulsion, and coordinate split crew activities across a gravitational balance point. What about the international partnerships operating without binding agreements? 23 nations signed the Artemis Accords, and those nations are not signing onto a moon program alone. Every partner is signing onto the first infrastructure that will carry humans beyond the moon, and a staggering bill documented by the Inspector General with no declared ceiling. That spending looks indefensible for a program that merely repeats what Apollo accomplished 50 years ago. But the cost changes character entirely if the program is building a road to two worlds simultaneously. Here is where the Apollo measuring stick shatters completely. Apollo was a sprint, a political weapon designed to plant a flag and prove a point. Every piece of hardware was expendable. Every mission was self-contained. Consider the Saturn V that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon. One flight, and then the ocean. Or the lunar module that landed on the Sea of Tranquility. The descent stage is still sitting on the surface, a monument to a visit that was never meant to be repeated with that specific machine. Comparing Apollo to Artemis is comparing a campsite to a city plan. Apollo proved the species could visit another world. Artemis is attempting to prove the species can build a permanent transportation network between worlds. The scope is not incrementally larger. The scope is categorically different. And the cost of that ambition is exactly what we have investigated: workforce atrophy between launches, because the cadence of a dual destination program demands hardware that takes longer to design, longer to test, and longer to certify than any single destination mission. International partnerships held together by goodwill instead of institutions, because the coordination framework for a moon-only coalition is already buckling under the weight of 23 signatories, and a Mars-forward coalition demands even deeper integration. A budget that grows without a declared ceiling, because no government accountant can price a multi-decade, multi-planet engineering campaign with enough confidence to put a number on the final line. Cascading engineering failures that turn every fix into a new crisis, because every subsystem must now meet two sets of requirements, lunar and Martian, and the overlap is not always clean. Every structural failure described in the first 3 acts is the price of building a system that no human civilization has ever attempted. Infrastructure designed to carry a species from one planet to another. Stop and measure the distance between where this case started and where the evidence now points. The dread from the previous 20 minutes of evidence is still completely warranted. Every structural fragility documented is real, but the source of the fragility has shifted. Incompetent engineering is not the cause, and broken management, despite every headline suggesting otherwise, is not the cause either. The program is fragile because the ambition is so large, that the political and institutional systems supporting the effort were never designed to sustain a commitment of that scale. Every force that collapsed, constellation that buried the post, Apollo plans that ended every ambitious program the moment political direction shifted, is pressing against an architecture that now has farther to fall and more to lose than any predecessor. One question rises from this evidence, and the question is not whether NASA can build a rocket to the moon. What matters now is whether any system humans have constructed, democracies, budgets, international coalitions, can sustain an engineering project that spans decades, costs hundreds of billions, and delivers returns that no single generation of voters will survive to see completed. The ambition is real. Every blueprint is documented, and absolutely nothing guarantees the system will hold together long enough to finish the job. Rockets can be built, capsules can be tested, heat shields can be redesigned until the charring patterns match the simulations. 4 acts of evidence have documented the ambition, the cascading failures, the structural causes underneath, and the revelation that the moon is a rehearsal for Mars. But none of those findings answer the question that matters most. Can the structures surrounding the hardware, the contracts, the coalitions, the funding commitments, survive long enough to matter? Because every moon program that died over the past 50 years had plenty of ambition. What killed those programs was never the size of the dream. The kill mechanism was structural. Political cycles rotating faster than hardware development, budget profiles that erased priorities with every election, and the absence of anything left behind that the next leader would inherit. Artemis must answer a question none of those predecessors survived. Has this program built an architecture durable enough, an architecture with enough structural anchors to outlast the forces that have destroyed every previous attempt? Start with what has already flown. The Space Launch System launched successfully on an uncrewed test, sending Orion farther from Earth than any crewed spacecraft has ever traveled. The capsule completed a 25-day lunar orbit and returned safely. Then, in April of 2026, Artemis 2 carried the first human crew toward the moon since 1972. 2 flights. 1 uncrewed, 1 crewed. Hardware that has not only been designed and tested, but has now carried human beings beyond low Earth orbit. That mission validated the launch vehicle, the deep space navigation, and the European service module that provides propulsion, power, and life support for every crewed flight. 6 of those modules are under contract, tying 6 Orion missions to Airbus manufacturing floors in Bremen, Germany. The hardware dependency crosses sovereign borders. Canceling the program would mean canceling contracts that cross those borders, disrupting production at a foreign aerospace facility, and unwinding obligations negotiated between governments. Constellation died with a single domestic policy decision. Terminating Artemis would require dismantling an entire international supply chain, piece by piece, across multiple countries. Commercial partnerships create a second structural layer. SpaceX holds the Human Landing System contract. Blue Origin holds a competing lander contract for missions beyond the initial landing. Axiom Space is developing spacesuits for lunar surface operations. Each company has invested private capital alongside federal funding, hired dedicated engineering teams, leased testing facilities, and built production timelines extending years past current milestones. Termination does not simply redirect a budget line. Termination strands commercial hardware in partial assembly, kills private workforce pipelines across multiple states, and writes off investments distributed across enough congressional districts to make the political arithmetic of cancellation more painful than continuation. Apollo operated without a single commercial partner. No private company held a landing contract under any previous return effort. Artemis has woven the engineering work into a commercial network whose workforce planning, whose factory floor schedules, and whose investor expectations depend on the program continuing. 23 nations signed the Artemis Accords. Japan is contributing habitat technology for the gateway. European service module production embeds European engineers into every crewed lunar mission for the foreseeable future. Walking away from the program means walking away from 23 diplomatic relationships. And the timing could not be worse, because China is actively assembling a rival coalition to build a competing lunar outpost. The diplomatic cost of abandonment, measured in seeded partnerships and lost influence over the rules governing future lunar activity, is a variable that no previous moon program carried. And the program has already passed the test that killed Constellation, a transfer of executive power. Jim Bridenstine departed NASA in January of 2021. The person who had named the program championed the effort publicly and declared in the official foreword that Americans were going back to the moon, left office before the first launch. Bill Nelson, a former senator and former space shuttle payload specialist who had personally flown in orbit, inherited the program midstream. Nelson reviewed the architecture, assessed the contracts, and chose to continue. Then another presidential transition came. A different leader took the chair, reviewed the same contracts, and continued the trajectory. The same hardware pipeline continued without interruption. 2 transitions and 2 new leaders with no change in direction. No previous lunar return effort has survived even a single transition of power. The prosecution rests. Artemis is not held together by inspiration or political speeches, commercial contracts, international dependencies, and hardware that has orbited another world form, an interlocking web. A dual destination design philosophy gives the architecture a second purpose that predecessors never possessed. Emotional momentum fades between elections. Contractual architecture, by contrast, persists regardless of who occupies the White House. Now for the defense, and the defense carries evidence of equal weight, because every anchor the prosecution just described has a fracture running through the foundation. The evidence is real, but the evidence for collapse is not a matter of pessimism. The evidence for collapse is 50 years of documented history, pressing against every structural claim with the weight of repeated precedent. The commercial contracts, the international dependencies, the hardware that has already orbited the moon, all real, all load-bearing, and all resting on ground that has collapsed before, under conditions that looked equally sturdy at the time. The Constellation precedent is the single most damaging data point against survival, and the precedent deserves one final, careful look. In October of 2009, the Ares 1X rocket ignited at the Kennedy Space Center, climbed to 46 kilometers, and performed exactly as designed. 6 years of development, billions committed, bipartisan support distributed across multiple states, contracts spanning NASA centers in Huntsville, Houston, and the Cape, a clear destination backed by a proven flight test. 12 months later, a new president canceled every contract. An independent review panel concluded the budget trajectory was unsustainable. Sound engineering has never protected a program from a fiscal judgment. Not once. The gap between that precedent and the current situation is narrower than the prosecution argues. The structural anchors are different in kind, commercial partnerships and international hardware dependencies that Constellation never possessed. But the fiscal exposure is identical. No total campaign cost estimate exists. The Government Accountability Office has flagged the gap repeatedly. Apollo had a declared finish line, roughly $200 billion in current dollars, a staggering figure, but a number that Congress could defend. The current effort has no finish line. A program without a declared cost can be cut at any point by any Congress for any reason, and every year without that number, the political case for continuation erodes a fraction further. The dual destination philosophy, which the prosecution presented as a stabilizing anchor, also functions as a vulnerability multiplier. Every subsystem designed for 2 worlds demands more testing, longer certification timelines, and deeper integration reviews than any single destination equivalent. The pressurized rover must survive lunar temperature extremes and function as a prototype for Martian terrain. The Gateway Station must demonstrate long-duration habitation at a gravitational balance point that no crew has ever occupied for months. The split crew mission profiles demand autonomous operations that no astronaut team has rehearsed outside a simulator. Each dual-purpose requirement extends the schedule, and every schedule extension widens the window during which a budget review, a leadership change, or a geopolitical shift could trigger the same fiscal verdict that ended Constellation. The Mars forward ambition makes the architecture grander. The same ambition makes the architecture more fragile. because the time required to validate a dual destination system is longer than any single political administration, and the evidence arrived in real time. In February of 2026, NASA redefined Artemis 3, the mission marketed for 9 years as the grand return of boots to the lunar surface, as a 30-day systems test in low Earth orbit. The landing was pushed to Artemis 4, targeted for 2028. 9 years of planning, and the landing mission changed names, changed destinations, and slipped 4 years because the compounded technical risk of attempting too many firsts on a single flight exceeded what the agency could justify. The pattern the defense warned about is not hypothetical. The pattern is already visible in the mission numbers. The international coalition carries the same structural question. 23 signatures look formidable on paper, but the Inspector General found no comprehensive forums for partner participation in flight planning, no standing working groups, and no overarching agreement defining roles or cost obligations beyond the near-term flights. Compare that framework to the Space Station Partnership, which forged coordination structures over decades of shared operations. The current coalition is held together by diplomatic warmth rather than institutional machinery, and diplomatic warmth evaporates the moment a partner nation concludes the costs exceed the returns. Then comes the variable that towers over the entire case. China has declared a crewed lunar landing before 2030. The Chinese Space Agency has placed hardware on the lunar surface twice, including the first successful touchdown on the far side. A Chinese crew station circles Earth with a rotation cadence exceeding what the International Space Station achieved early on. If Chinese astronauts reach the surface before the next crewed landing, American political consensus fractures along predictable fault lines. One faction declares the race lost and demands funding redirection. Another demands acceleration at any price. A third argues for partnership rather than competition. No faction argues for patience, and patience is the single resource the program cannot survive without. The defense rests. Every force that has killed a lunar return effort across 50 years of broken promises is documented and present. Those forces press against the Artemis architecture with the same structural weight they have always carried. Both cases stand. Both cases carry hard evidence, and the gap between the two, the space where neither prosecution nor defense can deliver a decisive verdict, is where the genuine finding of this investigation resides. On one side, structural anchors without precedent. Commercial contracts binding private industry across congressional districts, with termination costs distributed across enough states to make cancellation a political hazard. Hardware dependencies crossing sovereign borders, a capsule that has already circled the moon, and a design philosophy tying every component to a second destination, making abandonment more expensive than continuation. On the other side, anchors resting on ground that has collapsed before, a budget profile vulnerable to the same fiscal judgment that killed a predecessor with a successful flight test on the record. Allies operating on goodwill rather than binding agreements, a workforce losing fluency between launches, and a geopolitical competitor on a timeline that punishes the one variable the program requires above all others. I have weighed both sides, every anchor and every fracture, and the honest conclusion is not a verdict. The honest conclusion is a diagnosis. One variable determines whether the structural anchors hold or the structural fractures win. Time. The program does not need more money. The program does not need better engineers or stronger alloys or faster rockets. What the architecture requires is decades. An unbroken chain of funding decisions, leadership transitions, and cooperative agreements stretching across a span longer than most careers, longer than most political movements, longer than the attention span of any electorate in history. Engineering has been validated, partnerships assigned, the scope is documented in hardware that has already orbited another world. And here is why the timeline matters more than any single engineering challenge. The Gateway Station has no crew aboard. The pressurized rover exists as a contract, not a vehicle. The ISRU demonstration hardware has never processed a gram of lunar regolith. Every component of the permanent infrastructure, the pieces that separate a visit from a sustained presence, exists in a state between blueprint and reality. Crossing that gap requires a minimum of 10 to 15 more years of consistent investment. 10 years spans at least 2 presidential transitions. 15 years spans 3 or 4. And every transition is a moment when the entire architecture, every contract, every partnership, every dollar committed sits exposed to a review that could conclude, as one review concluded in 2010, that the trajectory is unsustainable. The clock does not pause between elections. The hardware does not wait for political consensus to stabilize. And the question of whether the patience holds is not a question that can be answered in advance. The answer arrives one budget cycle at a time, one appropriations vote at a time, one leadership transition at a time. Will the patience hold? Nobody alive can answer that question. The answer depends on decisions not yet made, by officials not yet elected, facing pressures not yet formed. What the evidence can measure with precision is the distance between where the program stands today and where certainty would begin. That distance is vast. No binding framework covers missions beyond the 4th flight. No architecture for permanent lunar presence exists as anything more than a concept drawing. And the measuring stick from the first act of this investigation transformed entirely. Nobody is asking anymore why this species cannot match the speed of a Cold War sprint. The real question is different. Can any system humans have ever constructed, democracies, appropriations committees, coalitions held together by accords and handshakes, sustain a commitment that outlasts the patience of every voter who will ever fund the effort? Every structural anchor the prosecution identified holds weight. Every structural fracture the defense identified holds equal weight. At this moment, Artemis is the most resilient lunar effort ever launched, and the most exposed to the forces that have ended every return effort since Apollo. Both truths coexist. Neither cancels the other, and the space between those two truths is not a failure of analysis. The space between those two truths is the finding itself. 53 years and counting. The footprints on the moon have been waiting in the dust, untouched, since Gene Cernan climbed back into the lunar module for the last time. The engineering failures documented across 4 acts of evidence are solvable. Hydrogen leaks can be sealed. Heat shields can be redesigned, tested, and certified for crewed flight. Spacesuits can be contracted to commercial providers. But the political vulnerability, the structural exposure to a system that resets priorities every 4 years, has no engineering fix. Whether new footprints join the old ones depends on patience. A specific kind of patience, the kind that holds steady across decades, that no democracy has ever sustained, outside one Cold War exception that history will not offer again. What has been built is genuine. What threatens the effort is equally genuine. And the distance between blueprint and boots on the surface is measured not in miles, but in years of will that nobody alive can promise. So how much of this is true? 5 acts of evidence, a budget that dwarfs any previous human spaceflight effort, a heat shield that surprised the engineers who built the shield, and a workforce launching so rarely that muscle memory fades between flights. The case file is thick, but a thick case file is not the same as a clean one, and before this inquiry reaches a verdict, the noise needs to be separated from the signal, because some of the fear surrounding Artemis is earned, and some of the fear is garbage. Start with the loudest claim, the narrative that dominates comment sections, editorial boards, and cable news panels whenever a deadline slips. NASA is broken. The agency is a bloated bureaucracy that has forgotten how to build rockets, forgotten how to innovate, and forgotten how to deliver results on a timeline that justifies the cost. That narrative is everywhere, repeated so often that repetition alone starts to feel like evidence. And the narrative is wrong. NASA is not broken. NASA designed, built, and launched the most powerful rocket ever constructed for carrying human passengers. That vehicle reached the moon, spent 25 days in orbit, and brought a capsule through re-entry at speeds that no crewed spacecraft had previously endured. At liftoff, the Space Launch System generated 8.8 million pounds of thrust, more than any vehicle in the current American fleet, more than any vehicle any nation has launched with a human-rated payload. The European service module, integrated into a design that crosses sovereign engineering boundaries, delivered power and propulsion flawlessly across 250,000 miles. Orion navigated deep space, maintained thermal stability, and splashed down within visual range of the recovery ship. That is not a broken agency. That is an agency that accomplished a feat one no other organization on Earth had managed since December of 1972. The bloated bureaucracy narrative also ignores what the commercial partnerships have already produced. SpaceX holds the Human Landing System contract and has committed engineering teams, test infrastructure, and launch cadence, all aimed at a vehicle that will carry astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface. A second lander contract, awarded to Blue Origin, covers missions beyond the initial landing attempt. Axiom Space is developing spacesuits for surface operations. Those are not government contractors padding invoices in a cubicle. Those are private companies that have staked workforce pipelines, factory floor schedules, and investor capital on the program continuing. The partnership model that Artemis uses did not exist under Apollo, did not exist under Constellation, and represents a structural departure from every previous lunar effort. Dismissing the entire enterprise as a broken bureaucracy requires ignoring every piece of hardware that has already flown, every contract already signed, and every dollar of private capital already committed. Then comes the conspiracy-adjacent version, the claim that NASA is deliberately wasting money, stretching timelines to justify continued funding, protecting a jobs program distributed across congressional districts, rather than pursuing an efficient path to the lunar surface. I've heard the argument a dozen different ways, and the argument collapses under the same evidence every time. The delays documented across this case have specific, traceable engineering causes. Hydrogen leaking through microscopic gaps in valve fittings, gaps that no amount of tightening could permanently seal. A heat shield ablating in patterns that no ground test replicated. A spacesuit effort that burned through 16 years and $1 billion without delivering a single piece of hardware ready for flight. Those are not symptoms of deliberate waste. Those are symptoms of a program confronting problems that do not have quick solutions, on hardware that must keep human beings alive, in an environment that punishes every error with death. The difference between waste and difficulty is measurable. Waste produces nothing. Difficulty produces lessons, redesigns, and eventually hardware that works. Every failure documented across 4 acts of engineering evidence produced a concrete next step. The hydrogen leaks led to redesigned seals and updated procedures. After the heat shield anomaly, engineers launched a comprehensive design review that reshaped the thermal protection roadmap. Meanwhile, the spacesuit crisis produced a commercial contract that shifted the development model entirely. Progress measured in fixes, not in excuses. But the opposite narrative is equally misleading. The cheerful version, promoted by official press releases and aerospace industry boosters, frames every delay as a minor speed bump on an inevitable road to the moon. The timeline slipped? Well, engineering is hard, and rockets are complicated machines that occasionally surprise the people who build them. The heat shield charred unexpectedly? Engineers will figure the problem out the way engineers always do. Budget climbing past every projection? Just the cost of investing in a future worth building. That narrative is comfortable. And the comfort is dangerous, because the comfort papers over fractures that have ended every previous attempt to return. The delays are not minor. The original Artemis 3 landing was scheduled for 2024. As of 2026, the landing mission is not Artemis 3 at all. The mission that was marketed for 9 years as the grand return of boots to the lunar surface has been redefined as a low Earth orbit systems test. The actual landing has been pushed to Artemis 4, targeted for early 2028, with no guarantee the new date will hold. The mission number changed, the destination changed, and the timeline slipped by 4 years and counting. 4 years of schedule erosion is not a speed bump. 4 years is the entire duration of most presidential terms. Enough time for an incoming administration to review the program, question the returns, and redirect the funding toward a competing priority. Every year of delay is a year of political exposure, and political exposure is the single variable that has terminated every lunar return effort in the past half-century. The cost narrative also requires honest examination. Over 13 years of cumulative spending, the bill has climbed past $93 billion. That number is real. The Inspector General documented the figure, and the Inspector General also documented a detail more troubling than the total. NASA has never produced a total campaign cost estimate for the Artemis program. Not for the landing missions, not for the gateway, not for the base camp, not for the pressurized rover. No number exists anywhere in the public record. No ceiling and no floor. The agency was asked directly by the Government Accountability Office to provide a life cycle cost estimate. NASA formally declined. A program spending billions of dollars per year with no declared total cost is a program that cannot be defended with a number when the next appropriations debate arrives. And every appropriations debate is a survival test. I kept returning to that single word. Non-concurred. A formal rejection of a formal recommendation from a federal watchdog office. The Inspector General recommended a total cost estimate. NASA said no. That refusal is not a bureaucratic footnote. Consider why the refusal matters by looking at the precedent. Apollo had a number. The program cost roughly $25 billion in 1960s dollars, which translates to approximately $200 billion in current value. Staggering, yes, but a declared number gave defenders a concrete anchor to rally behind. Congress could weigh the cost against the goal and commit to defending a defined investment. Artemis has no equivalent anchor. Without a total cost, the political conversation shifts. The question stops being, is the investment worth the destination? The question becomes, how much longer do we keep writing checks? That second question, the one about duration rather than value, is exactly what ended Constellation, and the question has no natural endpoint when no total cost has been declared. That missing number is not an oversight. Missing numbers are vulnerabilities built into the foundation of a program that depends on sustained political support to survive. And the workforce challenge is not a metaphor. The 3-year gap between operational launches is a documented operational risk, formally flagged by Kennedy Space Center managers during the Artemis I campaign. Experienced technicians do not sit idle during those gaps. Experienced technicians leave. SpaceX offers faster project cycles and competitive salaries. Blue Origin, Relativity Space, Rocket Lab, and a dozen defense contractors compete for the same talent pool. Every month between flights, the hands-on knowledge that keeps launch teams sharp, knowledge that procedure manuals cannot fully capture, disperses across an industry that rewards speed over patience. And when the next launch campaign begins, the learning curve resets to a level close to zero. What legacy procedures prescribed and what the actual hardware demanded turned out to be two different realities. That mismatch cost months of calendar time during the first campaign alone. That cost will recur with every subsequent mission unless the flight rate increases to a tempo that allows familiarity to accumulate. And the flight rate depends on the budget. And the budget depends on Congress, which operates on a rhythm dictated by elections, not by when a rocket needs to fly. Now, separate proven from possible, from unknown. Because the honest finding of this case is not a single verdict. The honest finding is a map with clear zones and fog. Proven. The hardware works. A rocket launched on an uncrewed test, a capsule orbited the moon, and a heat shield survived re-entry at velocities exceeding any threshold a crewed vehicle had ever faced. Then, a crewed mission followed, carrying 4 astronauts toward the moon for the first time in over half a century. Commercial partners are building landers and spacesuits, with private capital invested alongside federal funding. 23 nations signed cooperation accords. 6 European service modules are under contract, tying the program to cross-border manufacturing commitments that span sovereign boundaries. 2 presidential transitions have occurred since the program was announced. Each time, the trajectory continued without interruption. The structural anchors documented are real, measured, and unprecedented in the history of post-Apollo lunar efforts. Every earlier return program collapsed before surviving even one change of leadership. Artemis has cleared 2 and continued without a single change in direction. But the other side of the ledger is also proven, and the evidence on that side carries equal weight. The delays are real, and the cost is staggering. No total campaign estimate exists. No architecture for permanent lunar presence has been finalized beyond concept-level drawings. The international partnerships lack the institutional coordination mechanisms, the standing working groups, the joint planning boards, and the dispute resolution frameworks that the International Space Station Partnership established through decades of shared operations. The workforce loses fluency between launches spaced years apart, and the heat shield, the single most critical safety system on a crewed re-entry vehicle, behaved in ways that no simulation predicted and no ground test replicated. Every vulnerability that collapsed. Constellation, a program with a successful test flight on the record, remains present in the current budget profile. Possible. The Mars Forward Design philosophy, documented in Act 4, is the actual strategic driver behind the architecture, not a post hoc justification invented to excuse the cost. The evidence for this claim is strong. Multiple NASA planning documents, strategy presentations, and policy directives describe the dual destination logic in plain language. The Gateway orbit was selected because the same orbital mechanics work at Mars. The pressurized rover exists because a similar vehicle will be needed on the Martian surface, and testing at the Moon is safer than testing at a planet 7 months away. Split crew mission profiles rehearse how the first Mars crew will operate, but possible is not proven. A design philosophy written into planning documents is not the same as a funded Mars mission with crew manifested and hardware in production. The gap between those two positions is vast, and nothing in the current political environment guarantees the gap will close. Design philosophies can be abandoned between administrations. Planning documents can be superseded by a single policy directive. A future administration could strip the Mars Forward elements from the architecture, reduce the program to a minimal lunar landing, and claim victory without ever building the infrastructure that gives the delays their grander meaning. The dual destination logic elevates the program from a repeat of Apollo to a qualitatively different endeavor. But the logic depends on continuity of intent across administrations, and continuity of intent, as this case has documented, is the most fragile variable in the entire system. Unknown whether the political and financial system surrounding Artemis can sustain a commitment that outlasts any single administration. No evidence available today can resolve that uncertainty because the resolution depends on choices not yet confronted by leaders not yet sworn in under pressures that have not yet materialized. The structural anchors are designed to make cancellation more expensive than continuation. Commercial contracts distributed across congressional districts, international hardware dependencies crossing sovereign borders, and a capsule that has already circled the Moon. But 50 years of documented history shows that structural anchors have failed before. Constellation is the proof. Bipartisan support, contracts spanning multiple NASA centers, a successful flight test on the record, and the program still died because an executive review concluded the budget trajectory was unsustainable. Sound engineering has never, not once in the history of American spaceflight, protected a program from a fiscal judgment delivered by a new administration. And one variable towers above the verdict. China has declared a crewed lunar landing before 2030. Chinese missions have already placed hardware on the lunar surface twice, including the first successful touchdown on the far side. No other nation had reached that terrain, and a Chinese crew station now circles Earth at a rotation tempo matching what the International Space Station achieved in the early years. Should Chinese astronauts set foot on the Moon before the next Artemis crew launches, the American political consensus will split along predictable lines. One faction declares the race lost and demands funding be redirected elsewhere. Another demands acceleration regardless of cost or risk. A third argues for partnership rather than competition, abandoning the race entirely. But across every faction and every argument, one position is conspicuously absent. No faction argues for patience. And patience is the resource the program cannot survive without. After 6 acts of evidence, I have weighed every anchor and every fracture documented across this case. The verdict, then, is not a verdict. A diagnosis is closer to the truth. The program stands today as the most durable lunar effort since the original landings, and simultaneously the most vulnerable to the forces that have buried every successor. Both conditions are true. Neither cancels the other. The program has built structural defenses that no previous effort possessed, and every one of those defenses rests on ground that has collapsed before, under the weight of the same institutional forces pressing against the foundation right now. But the case does not end with the verdict, because one question that nobody in the debate, not the critics and not the defenders, is asking, and the question changes the calculus entirely. What happens if Artemis is the last attempt? Not the last attempt this decade, and not the last attempt before the next election. The last attempt, period. The final time the species musters the institutional will, the budget, the coalition, and the engineering talent to try reaching another world with the intention of staying. That question is absent from every editorial, every congressional hearing, and every press conference about schedule delays. But the question deserves more attention than any individual hardware failure, because the answer determines whether the 50-year gap becomes permanent. Consider the pattern. Apollo reached the moon in 8 years and abandoned the effort within 3. Constellation reached a successful test flight and was cancelled within 12 months. Every post-Apollo program designed to send astronauts back has buckled under the same weight, election cycles turning faster than rockets can be built, budgets wiping the slate clean with every new Congress, and nothing permanent left of the destination for the next leader to inherit. Artemis has built more structural anchors than any predecessor, but if those anchors fail, if the commercial contracts unwind, if the international partners withdraw, if the budget trajectory triggers the same fiscal judgment that buried Constellation, the species will not simply start over with Artemis 2.0. The talent pipeline will scatter. The institutional knowledge will vanish for a second consecutive time. And the political appetite for another $100 billion lunar program, after watching 2 efforts collapse in succession, will not exist. No president will stand before Congress and ask for the money. No appropriations committee will authorize the funds. The pattern will have spoken louder than any speech. 2 programs launched, 2 programs collapsed, and the political lesson will be simple. The moon is a trap that swallows budgets and delivers nothing permanent. That lesson will be wrong, but the lesson will be believed. And the precedent that failure would establish is devastating. Reaching another world is a capability humans have demonstrated beyond argument 6 times over across 3 years of Apollo landings. But remaining on another world, building a permanent presence, sustaining a commitment across the decades required to make the investment meaningful? If Artemis dies the way every predecessor died, humanity will have answered that question. Not with a declaration, with a pattern. A pattern repeated so many times that the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The species can visit, but the species cannot stay. The footprints on the moon are evidence of what humans achieved in a single decade of concentrated will. The 50-year gap after those footprints is evidence of what happens when the will expires. And if Artemis adds another chapter to that gap, the lesson taught by that failure will outlast every rocket, every contract, and every accord ever signed. The distance between a footprint and a foundation is not measured in engineering capability. The distance is measured in patience. And if the patience fails again, the species will have proven a devastating truth. The one problem human engineering cannot solve is the human institution that funds the engineering. 12 pairs of footprints have been sitting in the lunar dust since 1972. The engineering required to add new footprints is solved. Rockets can be built, capsules can fly, heat shields can be redesigned until the chairing matches the models. But the question the footprints are asking is not an engineering question. The footprints are asking whether any governing system that humans have constructed possesses the structural endurance to sustain a commitment across the decades required to turn a visit into a home. That question has no answer today. The answer is being written year by year, appropriation by appropriation, election by election, in the slow accumulation of decisions that will either carry the program to the surface or add Artemis to the list of promises that died before the boots touched down. 12 pairs of footprints still sitting in the regolith undisturbed since December of 1972. When this investigation began, those footprints looked like evidence of failure. 53 years and nobody has gone back. But the evidence no longer points where the evidence pointed at the start. The 50-year absence revealed that the achievement everyone assumed was repeatable had been a one-time exception, built on risk tolerances no modern program would accept. Cascading engineering failures, hydrogen leaks, heat shield charring, a billion-dollar spacesuit program with nothing flight ready to show, exposed a system where every fix generated a new crisis downstream. And the structural diagnosis went deeper, a workforce launching so rarely that muscle memory fades between flights, international partners operating on goodwill instead of binding agreements, and a budget that grows without a declared ceiling. Then the architecture revealed a second destination. The moon is the rehearsal, and Mars is the exam. Every anchor holding the program together, as the counter-evidence confirmed, rests on ground that has collapsed before. Is Artemis broken? The investigation found that broken is the wrong word. Proven, the delays are real, the cost has crossed $93 billion, and no plan exists beyond the fourth mission. Possible? The program is building an architecture qualitatively different from Apollo, a permanent transportation network between worlds, with every component designed to serve two destinations. Unknown. Whether a governing system built on 4-year cycles possesses the endurance for a project measured in generations. The honest answer is not a verdict. The honest answer is a diagnosis. A single variable separates survival from collapse, and that variable is time. This investigation began asking whether Artemis would succeed or fail. The deeper question is whether any system humans have built, democracies, appropriations, committees, coalitions held together by accords and handshakes, can sustain ambition long enough to turn a footprint into a foundation. The 12 marks in the dust are not evidence of what humans achieved. Those marks are evidence of what humans abandoned. Artemis is the test of whether abandonment is the permanent condition, or whether a species that proved the job could be done in 8 years can finally prove the commitment lasts longer than the hardware. Near the bottom of the moon, craters sit in permanent shadow. No light has reached those floors in billions of years, and water ice hides in that cold, frozen and waiting. The question is not whether the ice exists. The question is whether anyone will hold steady long enough to go and retrieve the ice. So here is what we know. Artemis is real. The hardware exists. Crewed missions to the lunar surface are closer now than they have been in half a century, but the evidence keeps pointing, stubbornly, toward a challenge bigger than any engine or heat shield. The challenge is endurance. Whether the institutions behind this program can hold steady long enough to finish what Apollo started, that is the question no blueprint can answer. These videos are a labor of love, but the research also takes a lot of late nights. Tracking down budget documents, checking mission timelines, verifying engineering claims, all of that work goes into every single episode. If you want to help by hitting that like and subscribe buttons, that would really help me out. I'm incredibly grateful for everyone who has supported the channel so far. But mostly, I want to know what you think. Did this deep dive miss anything about Artemis? Is the program further along or further behind than the evidence actually suggests? Let me know in the comments. I will catch you in the next one. Let curiosity guide you, keep learning, and know that you are always appreciated.